When people think back on Ravenloft, what most people tend to remember is the monsters and the domains. Something that's brought up a lot less are the unique spells that existed in the setting. A lot of these magics were meant more for NPCs and monsters rather than for players, as a lot of them had quite gruesome effects or dealt with the undead. Something that a lot of people also seem to forget is that back in the old days of Ravenloft, casting spells that were considered to have a evil nature to them, or any spell from the school of necromancy, had the risk of drawing the attention of the dark powers and potentially damning your character to a dark fate. But a lot of these spells were quite interesting, and could be used to give characters such as Strahd a unique set of advantages over the players. I looked over the old spells and I picked out 10 different ones that I would like to talk a little bit about and showcase for you. More so than ever, this isn't a top 10 list. I won't be presenting these in any specific order, I merely chose to limit myself to 10 spells. So, let's begin. Aura of Discomfort is a second level priest spell that might not seem that powerful or game-changing at a glance, but can definitely be used to great effect to mess with creatures. The spell lasts for an hour per level, and you need to touch your target to cast the spell on them. During that time, the target falls under several effects chosen by you. First off, you get to decide what temperature they experience. The span you have to choose from is pretty wide, from around a really cold winter morning to the highest temperatures recorded on Earth. Secondly, you get to choose a weather effect that affects the person as well. These can't be too extreme, and can only be things that would have a minor effect on them, such as rain, sleet or snow. But the devil is in the combination. The spell does impart some minor inconvenience and penalties to the victim in combat, but as we will see later, that's not really what this spell is about, although it can be very useful. All of these effects are completely invisible, even to the ones suffering from the curse, but it's important to note that they can protect themselves normally, as if it was real temperature and weather. Clothes and such definitely help, but the spell is a little bit less clear on if, for example, walking into a building would protect from a rain effect. I suppose, probably, but I can see a case for ruling no, as the weather is magical in nature and centered around the person, it's not actually falling from the sky as such. Now let's break down this spell a bit and get to why it's so nasty and some of the things you can do. If the caster is a high enough level, this spell has a good chance of just killing the person you cast it on. If it's a warm region or a warm season and you lower the temperature to the depths of winter, it won't take long for hypothermia to start setting in, and if they cannot find some way of heating themselves up, that's that. Add in some rain or wind on top of that. I'm not sure if you've been caught in freezing rain, but it has a way of sapping all the heat out of you. Same if you induce heat. The heat levels you can push on someone with this spell are insane. Like I said, they would experience something that is slightly hotter than the hottest natural heat recorded on Earth. You better hope you have easy access to water, or you will quickly dehydrate and die. It is also important to note that if you heat someone up in the middle of winter with this spell, they might have to get rid of all their clothing, and once the spell ends, they would freeze. Pretty nasty stuff overall for a second level spell. Our next spell is also a second level priest spell, although it's nowhere near as deadly. Zone of Deception is exactly what it sounds like, the reverse of the Zone of Truth spell. The spell affects a small area, a 5-foot square per level to be exact, and within that area any creature that fails its saving throw is forced to speak nothing but lies. The victim of this spell are free to formulate themselves however they wish, but any statement they make must be a lie. They can still ask questions, make suppositions and exclamations, as those are not statements and fall outside of the spell's effects. Something to keep in mind, just like with Zone of Truth, those under the effects of a spell immediately know what has happened, and that they are affected. But trying to explain that to someone not affected by the spell will be tricky. This spell can be tricky to use, a creature is likely to just step outside of a zone or avoid answering for its length to avoid lying, but there are situations where that can be impossible. The best way to use the spell that I came up with is to cast it on a witness during a trial. It can be a little tricky as the spell requires both somatic and verbal components, but it does have a range of 30 yards, so you might be able to get away with it by casting the spell through a window or from the back pews of a courtroom. The witness can hardly excuse themselves, and if they're being asked questions, any delays before answering or attempts to answer in a roundabout way to navigate around the spell are likely to cast doubts on the witness. Players could certainly use this spell, but I see it more as something to keep in the antagonist's toolbox. A way for a villain to be freed from court after capture by the group so he can go back to his evil ways and force the players to try to find another way to stop him. Maybe not the most useful spell, but an interesting one. Our next spell is a wizard spell, and one that also might seem to be somewhat limited in its uses and might just fit a NPC better than a player. Ground Fog conjures a large swath of fog that rises to about knee height for the average length person. As a 3rd level spell, that doesn't seem overly useful at a first glance, especially since it doesn't even offer cover or concealment that a normal fog spell would provide. The normal fog spell is only 2nd level, and although Ground Fog is bigger and lasts for hours, it might be hard to see why you would cast this one over the original. Well, there are a few things that the Ground Fog does that make it somewhat of an interesting spell. First off, the mist moves and swirls, never staying completely still. This means that when invisible creatures walk through the fog, you can't use disturbances in the fog to spot them. Secondly, you can hide quite a few things in knee-high fog. There are the obvious things, such as different types of traps. Trapdoors, caltrops, exploding glyphs, all of those can be hidden in the mist. The mist also radiates invocation magic, which means you might not be able to detect magical traps through it, at least not ones that are invocation or evocation based. Then there are things such as different types of difficult terrain. Mud or pools of water are also perfectly hidden by the fog. Different creatures can also use the fog to move around and do hit and run attacks on the players. A vampire mist form is effectively invisible within the ground fog, but any creature that can make itself small enough can hide within the fog, such as ghosts and shadows for instance, and of course also things such as swarms of rats or insects. But the biggest thing this spell does is mess with your players' minds. As they go into the boss battle, they suddenly have no idea if where they are placing their feet is safe, and might start second guessing their every movement. A player who uses Detect Magic on the mist might very well conclude that since Invocation is a school consisting largely of explosive attack magic, that the mist itself is dangerous, or they might jump to the conclusion that there are magical traps, even if your boss has no way of deploying any. And the constant swirl and movement of the mist might make some players jump to the conclusion that since there could be magical monsters, or invisible monsters in it, there have to be, or even worse, that the mist is somehow itself alive. Ground Fog is one of those spells that almost no player would ever choose, but that every vampire lord worth their salt should have in their back pocket. Eyes of the Undead is a practical 4th level spell for any Undead Overlord, and since it's available to both priests and wizards, there is really no reason any Necromancer villain of significant level shouldn't have it. Now, being a Necromancer is historically a very bad idea for a player character in Ravenloft, but it is something you can do, and this spell does definitely have its uses for players as well, but since playing a PC Necromancer is the exception rather than the rule, I'm mostly approaching this spell from the perspective of the villains. Simply put, the Eyes of the Undead allows you to borrow the sight and hearing of a corpse or an undead creature within 30 yards of you for a number of hours equal to your level. You can cast this on an undead creature that is not under your control, but it is able to resist the spell with saving throw if you do. Once the spell has been cast, you don't need to stay close to the creature or corpse. You can travel up to a mile away and still maintain the connection, making it a very useful tool for spying or just to keep track of your minions. If you really want to make the most of use of this spell, you can combine it with another one I won't be talking much about here, Corpse Whisper. It allows you to give commands to your undead creatures over large distances, meaning you can effectively remote control your zombie. With this spell in the mix, while running say Castle Ravenloft, every single undead creature that the player encounters could be a potential spy for Strahd and allow him to see up close and personal what the group is capable of. Another effective use of this spell is to reanimate small flying creatures such as bats and birds, and then you can use them to scout for pesky adventurers from the sky. Information is key in any conflict, so this spell can be quite powerful in the hands of a clever necromancer. Mimic Mortal is a 4th level wizard spell that, judging by its entry, is definitely originally meant for NPCs only, although because of the wording of the spell, anyone could use it technically, and it could be used to attempt to depower powerful undead enemies, although they would get a saving throw to avoid it. The spell can only be cast on an undead creature you touch, and it removes some of their weaknesses in return for sacrificing some of the creature's advantages. For every 2 levels the caster has, they can remove 1 weakness. You don't get to choose which weaknesses or abilities the undead creature loses. Instead, it loses its least detrimental weaknesses first in return for its most powerful abilities. It is clear from the spell description and the powers it exchanges that this spell is definitely meant to be cast on vampires, although it can perhaps be useful on some other creatures. As the name and description of the spell implies, the main use of this spell is to let a powerful undead creature pretend to be immortal for a while. After chasing a vampire for days on end, the players might be thrown off their hunt if they discover their supposed vampire walking around in broad daylight, undetectable by magics and ignoring any attempts at turning. Not only is the spell good for tricking players and NPCs alike, it can also have some strategic uses. If the players already have access to magical weapons and are holed up in a house that they have warded with garlic, a vampire might be willing to give up some abilities to get around those protections without losing too much. It can also be used by vampires to get around in the daytime, which can allow them to access to places where they would not normally go, or allow them to just get a little bit more travel time to escape the players. The big flaw with the spell is that it doesn't last very long. Its length is only 10 minutes, plus an additional 4 minutes for each level of the caster, which means at best you're buying yourself 90 minutes of walking in the sunshine. Still, a clever enough vampire that can be more than enough time for them to put an evil plan into motion, or buy themselves an alibi, or make sure that a slight delay while traveling doesn't result in them being turned into dust by the rising sun. Reign of Terror is one of those evil spells that's more menacing, thematic, or fun than it's good. It's a 4th level wizard spell that affects an area that is a mile in diameter, and it lasts for an hour, plus 10 minutes per level of the caster. If the sky is clear, it takes 10 minutes for black clouds to form, but if it's already overcast, the rain starts immediately. What exactly is the rain? Well, that's up to the wizard. Depending on the caster's level, you can call down all kinds of disturbing rain. Initially, you can only make it rain black putrid water, but at higher levels, you can gain access to things such as steaming blood, frogs, spiders, dead bats, or ash. If the creatures that start raining are living, then about half of them will survive impact and go about doing whatever traumatized frogs or snakes do, I guess. All of the things you can call down are disturbing, but none of them are exactly dangerous. Although an individual spider or snake, for instance, might be poisonous, most of them probably won't be, and the caster has no control over anything that rains down. I imagine that food and water supplies could potentially be fouled by some of these, but that's more long term. It's definitely not a combat spell. I see this more as the kind of spell that Strahd or Asselin throws at the players while they're hiding in a village to show them and the citizens that they really messed up and that Papa Darklord is a little bit miffed with them. It's definitely more of a spell that you use as a display of power or for intimidation than something that is actually useful in a practical sense, but that's kinda why I like it. Suppressed Lycanthropy is a 4th level wizard spell that is actually quite good to have in your toolbox as a player. You touch a lycanthrope, and if they fail a saving throw, they immediately turn back into their humanoid form. Even better, they are prevented from transforming out of their humanoid form for 3 minutes for each level of the caster. This is of course very useful when fighting werewolves and such, when they might have nasty abilities or attacks in their hybrid or animal form. For example, they have a much harder time biting or clawing you in a humanoid form, which might let you avoid becoming infected with lycanthropy yourself. But it can be used for other things than fighting too. A lot of werebeasts are innocent people under a terrible curse. Using this spell, you can temporarily transform them back so that you can talk to them and try to help them. Perhaps by taking them somewhere they cannot hurt themselves or anyone else, and locking them up for the night. You can also use this as a tool in an investigation. Some lycanthropes use the anonymity of their beast forms as a disguise so that they can hide amongst the villagers and attack as they please in the night. With this spell, you can remove that option from them. The only downside of a spell is of course that you need to touch the Howling Rage monster in the middle of combat, which can be tricky as a squishy wizard. There is also a darker, more sinister reverse version of the spell, which forces a lycanthrope instead to immediately transform, and if they are the cursed version, to lose control. You can of course use this as a way to test for lycanthropy, but it feels like it's a little bit of a dick move, and to be honest, one that might bite you in the ass, literally. Neverending Nightmare is a rather sadistic 4th level wizard spell that puts a curse on someone which will cause them to have repeating nightmares each time they try to sleep. The spell can be cast at any time and kicks in the next time the victim goes to sleep. During the night they will have terrible nightmares, but once they awake they won't quite be able to remember them. Unpleasant, but manageable. The real danger of a spell hits when a creature is forced to make a fear or horror check. When faced with such a thing, memories of the terrible dreams flood back and overwhelm the character. Mechanically speaking, under the effects of a spell, the creature will automatically fail any saving throw they need to do involving fear or horror. Fear and horror tend to turn up quite a lot, of course, in Ravenloft, so this spell can be pretty devastating. Thankfully, it's very easy to detect and cure if you're high enough level and you have the right tools. A creature under the effects of a spell radiates an aura of enchantment magic to anyone who uses Detect Magic, and a simple remove curse will remove the spell. The caster of course has no surefire direct way of triggering the spell, but crippling a key party member with fear can be devastating under the right circumstances, and the spell can definitely catch even experienced parties off guard. All of the spells on this list could easily be used to great effect by someone like Count Strahd von Zarovich, but the last two spells I wanted to talk about were invented by the famous vampire and are taken straight from his own spellbook. The first of these is Strahd's Baneful Attractor. It is a second level wizard spell that Strahd created by reversing Hornung's Baneful Deflector, a protective spell that causes spells cast at you to deflect to random targets around you. Not entirely surprising, Strahd's spell pulls in magic instead, causing any direct targeting spells cast within 15 feet of the target, except those who target the mind, to be redirected towards the victim. Now, there are a few ways that I see that this can be useful. One would be to cast it on yourself, and cause any helpful magic your enemies try to cast to instead be cast on you. This could prevent the group's frontline fighters from receiving heals, or let you steal something like a haste, for instance. Naturally, you could also cast this on an enemy, and then watch as their own wizards blast them to shreds as they try to target you. Then we have the eat your cake and keep it option of casting it on a powerful but expendable minion who acts as a bodyguard. This way any attack spells cast at you will hit your bodyguard instead, and it will also prevent beneficial spells to be targeted near them. It's a very devious spell, and one that can potentially destroy the plans of any party that relies too heavily on single target spells. I've saved the best for last, and it's definitely a spell intended to be used by the Dungeon Master's villains. Strahd's Malefic Meld is probably my favorite Ravenloft spell, and one that allows the Vampire Lord to cause all kinds of chaos. The spell allows a Necromancer to take the corpses of 3 different creatures and merge them all together to create a completely new and horrid monstrosity. There are some limitations, such as that they cannot span more than 2 size categories, so you could make a cat-bat-snake, but you couldn't make a cat-human-minotaur, because they are too different in size from each other. Ultimately though, it allows you to take the best aspects of 3 different monsters and put them all into one nasty critter. Like, how about combining a giant bat, shark, and an ostrich to make a creature that can fly, swim, and run fast, which also has a giant bite attack and can track people through echolocation. Strahd's personal favorite is the werewolf spider gargoyle, which can fly, spider climb, shoot webs, drain levels, and cannot be hit without magical weapons. You get the general idea. You can basically Frankenstein together any monstrosity you can think of and send it after your players, and if it fails, you can customize a new one that has an even better attack. Especially if the Necromancer using the beast was spying with the help of the eyes of the undead to see what worked and what didn't. There isn't really a lot holding an Evil Overlord back with this spell. It's a 5th level spell, so you might not be able to create more than a couple of abominations a day. The material components aren't that hard either, just a little bit of doppelganger bone dust, which might be a little bit tricky, but isn't impossible to find. The biggest problem you'll face is finding different interesting monsters to merge and whether or not they would be more effective on their own. One advantage is of course that you can take the remains of your enemies and use them as materials for the spell. And if you fail in finding powerful and interesting creatures to use, an army of undead bat rat spiders is always disturbing at least, and marginally more useful than their individual corpses raised by themselves. So, that was 10 spells unique to Ravenloft that have been largely forgotten, at least in my opinion. There were a bunch more spells back in the day, but these were some of the ones that I found to be the most interesting and would love to throw on my players someday, because let's face it, these are mostly for villains and NPCs. Let me know in the comments below if there were any spells you liked in particular, and as always, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this look at these lost spells, then why not give this video a like, and if you want to see more, then please subscribe. If you want to support the channel, then please share this video on social media. It really helps out a lot. And you can also follow me on Tumblr or Twitter, or check out my DM Guild page. Links to all of those below. Until next time, Dungeon Delvers.